light. So I'm actually going to go in and load an HDR into the scene and utilize that to work with. But for now, I'm just going to turn off this light because I might want to turn that on a little bit later. So in the environment slot, I can turn that texture back on now and we can see how that's looking. And I might just go in and change the HDR to be something a little bit more nighttime. So this is the HDR I used on the final mastering V-Ray lesson. So I'm just going to utilize that again. And you can see how that affects things straight away. Now also remember at the moment, I've got things set to direct lighting. Now within the direct, sorry, I just need to drag this over. Within the direct lighting, there's a couple of different options within the settings here that you can adjust to make things a little bit more realistic. So by default, the diffuse bouncing is set to ambient occlusion. So it's just using a simple ambient occlusion pass to give you shadowing in the scene. If I set this to diffuse, now it's going to start bouncing the diffuse values around the scene, and it's going to be kind of like a fake mix between ambient occlusion and GI lighting. Obviously, if I swap this to PMC, one thing that starts to happen in the scene is it starts to calculate all the metal caustics. But at this point, I still don't need to calculate that type of stuff in, so I'm going to leave it at direct lighting and diffuse and get back to working on the shader itself. So the coat can actually turns out to be a lot similar to a car paint, where you've got an underlying base metallic shader, and then over the top of that there's a clear coat of plastic that's like a lacquer. So to do that, inside of Octane, you can create mixed materials in a similar way to the V-Ray blend material, but this is where Octane's actually lacking a little behind V-Ray, and Octane makes things a bit more difficult for the user to really work with multi-layered materials, and they can get pretty advanced and hard to understand quickly. But for something simple like this, it's fairly easy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to create another glossy material. So in here, I'm just going to go simply make the diffuse value black. I'm going to increase the index to 1.6, something to more like a plastic. And if I increase that, you'll see there that we've got two different shaders now. Now, I'm going to blend them in the exact same way that I taught in the Mastering V-Ray course. So from the base material here, I'm going to drag out an Octane material, and I'm going to drag out a mixed material, which is very similar to a V-Ray blend material. And I'm going to load this material into the number 2 slot. Now the top coat, I'm going to add over material 1, and by default it's blending these two materials with just a pure value, so it's just blending 50% of the material itself. But I can actually change that and utilize a fall off map. So I'm going to drag a fall off map out here, and once again, every time you drag a texture out, it doesn't automatically change that, so I'm going to make this a texture, and now you can see we've got the two materials blending based on this fall off map. And as I go down here, more of that's coming through. But obviously we can't see that yet because the only material that's been applied to the shader ball is this base material. So this is where I'm just going to quickly go in and drag it on, just like so, using this kind of right circle button. I can just drag this out. Or I can select the stuff I want in the material editor, right click and just go assign material. And now you can see on the edges of the material, we get that kind of lacquered glossy coat coming through. If I raise the the index of refraction, you can see that it starts coming through more and more. And because it's all real time, we can just kind of very easily determine how far and how high you want to go on those different values. So I'm going to raise this up to about 3, just because I want it to be a bit more noticeable. And now, like I was saying earlier, we've got an option to mix these two, but the problem is once again, we don't have direct control over the color. So this is where I can just go in, same thing as always, drag out a mixed texture to here, set that to the amount, and just drag that in. Now I can set this to color and color, and we've got the same control, except this time I've got control over the front facing amount. So as I blend that in, you can see from the front angle, more of that gloss coat is coming through the ball. And on the Coke can, it's not like some materials I've seen that rely on that 90-degree angle to see that gloss coat coming through. The Coke can has a pretty strong lacquered top coat. So let me just bring up a reference of what I'm trying to explain here. So as you can see, front on facing, we still get a very strong appearance of that kind of mirror-like coating. And it's a little bit blurry, so on top of that, I can also go in and adjust the roughness to have a fall off for this top coat as well. Right now, the top coat is kind of just set to like 0.06 instead of having a mixed texture and a fall off map. So the easiest way to apply that is to simply copy the current mixed texture and fall off map I've already got and drag that to the roughness and just quickly go in there and change that to texture. Now obviously, because the top glossy coat's going to have slightly different settings, I just need to go in and make sure that that roughness is a little bit lower. So I'm going to drop this down to 8, and on the edges I'm going to go to 3, and it's just going to slightly blur things a little bit more. I'm also going to unhide the octane light in the scene that I'd turned off previously. And now you can see we just catch a nice highlight there. I'm going to go to the HDRI and change a couple of settings. I'm just going to drop the gamma down and increase the value. And now the easiest way to tell how the material's actually looking is either to rotate the HDRI or to rotate around the scene itself. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just start rotating this around to get the highlights hitting a couple of different areas. And you can see that where there's no reflection and lighting, the material goes completely dark, and there's a likely scenario that the base metal has some kind of diffuse value. So in a V-Ray setting, I'd like to stick to just having purely specular, but for the sake of, maybe the fact that there's a little bit of diffuse in the can itself, maybe through the painting or something like that, we can just experiment with adding some more color in. And now you can see as I go up, the can looks less metallic and has more of that plastic look. And I'll just get a reference up of how some of the Coke cans actually do look more like that. So here you can see the difference. This can's got a completely metallic look to it, and then this can's kind of, even in the dark areas, you've still got some color there, and you end up with a very similar kind of look. So like I was saying earlier, you can either rotate the HDR or you can just rotate around the scene. So I'm just going to zoom in on the ball here and kind of look at it from a few different angles. And you can see I've actually just moved that off. So yeah, I'm just going to move around, try and see how the material's looking. Every so often I'll go back to my reference. And I'm just trying to get an idea of how things are looking. So every so often you just let the render kind of clean itself. And I'm just going to drop the diffuse a little bit lower. So there's some there, but it's not completely overpowering the metallic look and feel of the actual render itself. Now, I could go in and explain a lot more about Octane, but I just wanted to kind of show you how to set up materials, the basic settings to work with. You can see I'm still using direct light, and I don't usually change that right up until the end of the project. But there's one more really important feature I want to explain, And that's if you go into the camera settings here. This is the key difference between V-Ray and Octane itself. So let me bring up the render dialog. Now, I mentioned this halfway through, I think in lesson 5 of mastering V-Ray, and that's the response curves that you can utilize directly out of Octane, and it's what gives you a totally different look to V-Ray. So a lot of the times you'll realize that in V-Ray renders, guys get their stuff looking like that final quality through that last little bit of post work. So guys like Bertrand Benoit on his architectural renders, you know, the renders themselves look good, but then he's got to go in and make some color adjustments and tweaks in post to give it that last little bit of realism. And this is what I've been trying to get V-Ray to actually implement, because it makes a big difference. So you can see here by default, Octane is utilizing this Agfachrome RSX2 color response curve. Now, there's the option of setting it to linear, and then it will behave like V-Ray. So if I set that to linear and use 2.2 as the gamma, this is how V-Ray will render the job. And I've had success getting things to look pretty similar, but not every job is going to, you know, require the same look and feel. And you can use these color response curves to totally change the color and lighting and feel of the render itself. So to give you an example of that, I'll just cycle through these camera response curves once again, and you'll see that as I change them, sometimes you need to go in and actually adjust the gamma for those curves themselves. So you can see here, using this totally different color response curve, I've just had to use a gamma of 1.0. So usually the difference between them is either using a gamma of 1 or 2.2, but I do mix and match. And depending on just how the render looks, because it's real time, you can easily adjust that stuff. And you're not actually, you'll notice as I change these settings, the render is still cleaning things. So if I zoom in here, you'll see that the pixels are still going to start to change. So I can change all these settings real time without worrying about that reset. You know, sometimes when you change the gamma, you've got to go higher and then drop down the actual exposure itself to get you the same look and feel. And this to me is what makes Octane so unique from all the other render engines, because I haven't seen one that actually implements this type of stuff directly into the renderer. And I haven't had the same level of success in V-Ray using its the render viewport settings that you've got enabled to the right. So you can see the difference between linear and some of these other curves is quite massive. But anyway, that's just a quick breakdown of Octane. Now I'm going to load up the Coke can scene, give you a quick rundown of that, and then to finish off the lesson, I'm going to show you how I utilized HDR Light Studio to reach the final result. And then once I've done that, like I was saying at the start of the lesson, I'm going to go in and utilize a couple of bonus passes to add some reflection underneath the can and maybe to a couple of other areas. So I'm going to try and finish that off in a kind of fast and optimized way, because like I said, at this early stage in the course, I just want to get you familiar with these tools that I'm going to be utilizing in the much more complex lessons later on. So at this point, the scene is pretty simplified. I've just loaded it up now. You can see I've split the viewport into the camera view and an orthographic view. And the reason I've done that is because if I swap to the camera view here, you can see that Octane starts rendering things. And in an orthographic view, I can go in and rotate around the scene without actually updating that, because at the moment, Octane can't work with an orthographic viewport. Whereas if I swap to a perspective viewport here, you'll see that Octane automatically starts trying to re-render everything. So the easiest way to navigate around the scene while you're working in Octane is to swap things to an orthographic view and then simply start adjusting things from there. So for example, I can go in and change some of the lights in the scene. Now, to set this scene up, it requires three different things. Firstly, it requires me to link HDR Light Studio, and because when I started this lesson, I only had HDR Light Studio 4, I'm going to stick with that for this particular lesson, and in later lessons when I utilize HDR Light Studio, I'll convert to HDR Light Studio 5. So you guys are probably used to using HDR Light Studio 4 at the moment, so for now, in this lesson only, we'll be utilizing this. Even though I have tested the new one out since starting the lesson, it's got way better features, but for the sake of kind of sticking to using legacy tools, I'll keep it simple. Right, so on top of using HDR Light Studio, I've got a couple of different things in the scene. I've got some specific Octane lights that I'm aiming at the ground in front of the can, and they're just creating a little bit of a highlight at the base and adding some shape and depth to the bottom of the can itself. Then on top of that, behind the can itself, I've got a couple of geometry lights. And these lights are used to cast the reflection you see on the edge of the can itself. So if I select those and hide them, you'll see that they are set to be movable proxies. So if I hide those, it'll automatically start re-rendering, and you can see straight away we lose all the shape we have and the definition that those lights bring to the edge of the can in helping to take it off the background itself. So I was kind of debating whether or not to add those, but the Coke can itself is a fairly iconic shape, and it really does help kind of bring that can's edge to life. So the first thing I need to do to set up a scene like this is actually link HDR Light Studio with Octane. And there's not really much information at the moment on how to work with the Octane plugins. So because the company's so new now, like at kind of infiltrating the industry, one of the things that's lacking with HDR Light Studio is some professional educational tool, like education out there to help you use it. So what do you actually do to link the two together? Well, the first thing you do is in the Utilities tab in 3ds Max, you can load up the HDR Light Studio Live plugin here, and it brings up a little box. But in order to simplify things, I'm just going to restart 3ds Max so it's totally fresh, like you'll experience when you're first setting it up. Okay, I've restarted 3ds Max. We've just got a couple of objects in the scene. I'm just going to go in, make HDR Light Studio the render engine. Make Octane the render engine. Once I've done that, I'm going to leave everything as default. I'm going to go in, create a simple glossy material and assign that to the two objects. Now, as usual, you can see there's no lighting in the scene. So to link the two, I'm going to go to the Utilities tab, load up HDR Light Studio. You can see that the current renderer is valid. The active connection with HDR Light Studio is active, and that just means it's licensed and linked. But right now the environment isn't actually loaded. So what I do to get that happening is in the map slot in the Slate Material Editor, I'm going to go to Octane, make a texture environment, and drag out a random texture. And here I'm just going to use the same Tokyo Big Sight HDR. In the environment slot, I'm just going to drag that in. And you should be able to see now that when I reload the geometry in the scene here, we're using that HDR to light things. But we still don't have HDR Light Studio connected. So once you load a random image, the reason you do that is I don't know why at the moment, it maybe is just a little bit of a kind of workaround, but basically you just need some kind of image linked into the texture environment for this to work. So from here, all I'm going to do is hit Start Live. and that's going to override the HDR in the scene. And you can see straight away that it goes to just simply using this grayscale background here. And if I turn off that, now everything goes dark. Yet now I can go in and create lights and link, and they're both linked together. And that's essentially all I've done to light the Coke can. So I'm going to go back into the scene now and start to break down how I've utilized HDR Light Studio to bring life to the can, as well as a quick run through while I'm adjusting those settings in HDR Light Studio, explain how I've set up some of the materials. So I'm back in the Coke can scene now. I'm just going to move away these other kind of random dialog boxes. And I'm going to go into HDR Light Studio and turn off everything that's actually enabled. So we've got the background, which I've loaded an HDR into. So now essentially the only thing lighting the scene is the two octane lights facing the bottom of the can and the backlights. So now I'm going to turn off the backlights, and I'll just start running you through how I've set this type of stuff up. Now you'll notice I did show you how to create octane lights, but one of the disadvantages of using just a pure octane light is at the moment you can't actually assign a texture to it. You've got to use some plane geometry for that. So in order to actually make these planes emit light in the same way that a standard octane light would, you've got to assign a emission texture to the shader in order for that to apply. Now another thing I've done is I've made these invisible to the camera. So I'm going to right click that, go to Object Properties, go to General tab and just make this visible to camera again. Now you can see this is the actual light I've got in the actual geometry itself. So if I go to the orthographic view here, they're both just the exact same orientation right behind the camera. Sorry, right behind the Coke can. And if I go into the geometry itself, you can see here I've got an octane diffuse material. The diffuse value is set to black. Now in the opacity slot, I've got a gradient texture, which I've just created, and I'll just show you that. And what this does is it acts similar to how HDR Light Studio does, in that if I create a square light here and set the fall off to low, you can see we get a similar effect happening where the light fades from perfectly white to dark at the edges. And I'm just trying to simulate that because the reason I'm utilizing actual raw geometry to light the back of the can is because the downfall of using HDR Light Studio to light the objects in the scene is that when you have geometry that's kind of, and I'll just close down this box here. When you have geometry that's covering the background environment, you lose the reflection from HDR Light Studio. So in V-Ray, there's a few tricks you can use with how it is visible to reflections and refractions and options like that, but they're not available in Octane. So sometimes you need to actually go in and use raw geometry for reflections.